Hi, this is Ed Driscoll, and we're talking with Andrew Klavan, screenwriter, author of the novels True Crime and Don't Say a Word, which were adapted into movies starring Clint Eastwood and Michael Douglas, respectively, and a contributor to Ricochet.com, Glenn Beck's GBTV.com, and a fellow columnist here at PJmedia.com. And Andrew, thanks for taking some time to talk with us today.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's great to be here.
We should probably start with the shock news of the past week, the death of someone we both knew, Andrew Breitbart. Drew, you're in the Los Angeles area, so you probably had much more frequent contact with Andrew than I had. How surprised were you by the news?
I was shocked, but I was not surprised at all. I wish I had been more surprised. I mean, I don't think there was anyone who knew Andrew who didn't repeatedly tell him to slow down. He had been in the hospital, 8 months or a year ago. I talked to him while he was in the hospital, and he was his usual self. You know, he had some kind of heart problem, and yet he was his usual, full of energy, full of steam and outrage. And you know, I was on the phone saying, "Slow down." I could hear his wife off mic is saying to him to slow down. So it was not a surprise, but it was a shock. I mean, the guy was unique. He had a unique understanding of how information flowed. I never saw anything like it, and it was a very peculiar kind of genius. I used to compare him to Fred Astaire, because I've always noticed that if Fred Astaire had been born a little earlier or a little later, he just would have been a dancer. But he was born into this perfect moment when what the world needed was Fred Astaire. And Breitbart, in the same way, had this kind of genius that simply didn't exist before the Internet existed. And 20 years from now might be something that everybody has because the Internet will have become familiar to us. But he understood when he talked about how information flowed and how the left corrupted the flow of information, he made it visual. He actually seemed to see what he was talking about. And he had this unique genius for affecting that flow, for time, the way he timed stories, the way he released them, the ways he held information back until the mainstream media made their attempt to corrupt the narrative and then slammed them with a second punch that brought the narrative back where he believed the truth lay. And to lose that skill, to lose that talent, it's not only, I was extraordinarily fond of the man personally. I was very, very fond of him, and to lose him is a personal blow, but just speaking, politically and culturally, I think to lose that particular skill, he was just irreplaceable.
Drew, as a writer of fiction and nonfiction and your own one-man videos, you're obviously aware that tone is a very important component of writing. What did you make of the incredibly vile tone of Breitbart's detractors in the immediate wake of the news of his passing away?
Well, whenever I see things like that, Breitbart was famous for retweeting the ugliest attacks on him. When somebody would tweet some really vile, filthy attack, he would retweet it. In fact, the very last time I saw him, he was describing to me how difficult it was to do that the first time, and then after he did it a couple of times, he began to really enjoy it. And whenever I see that kind of vileness that the left does seem to produce much more steadily and reliably than the right, I think to myself, if I looked in the mirror and saw that my philosophy had turned me into that person who danced on the graves of my political opponents, not my enemies, my political opponents, that person who spewed kind of this exorcism-like filth on the misfortunes of my opponents, this person who was willing to lie to get my way, I would reconsider my political philosophy. That would be enough to make me think, my God, my political philosophy has turned me into this kind of demon. Maybe my political philosophy is wrong, but somehow, I guess, once you've become that corrupted, and once you've sunk that low and become that vile, that it doesn't occur to you to go back to the root causes of it and fix them because you are now that person. So I think that Breitbart retweeted them because he realized they didn't say anything about Andrew at all. They didn't say, they had nothing to say about him. They just identified the nature of the people who were his enemies. And I think that only makes him look all the better.
Beyond inventing political jiu-jitsu on Twitter, what do you think Breitbart's most important contributions to new media and conservatism will ultimately be?
Funnily enough, it's a really good question. And I think, funnily enough, it's not going to be what he considered and many people considered his kind of masterpieces, the taking down of Acorn, defeating, forcing Anthony Weiner to resign. Those wonderful moments when his just sheer skill and brilliance at wrong footing this huge machinery of lies that is our mainstream media would come to the fore, and he would take somebody down. It was more his work, I think, as a publisher, as a guy who was creating a new form of newspaper as the newspaper was dying. We all know the newspaper is dying, and we all know the internet is taking its place, but there aren't that many people who are working to create that model in a workable way, so that we can get reliable information, so that we can understand what we're hearing, so that we can react to the narrative quickly. And that, I think, is what Breitbart's legacy is going to be, that he began to build not just in Drudge and the Huffington Post, which, after all, he had a big hand in creating, but in his big sites, that he started to show us the ways in which the Internet could be used to become a new and respectable and powerful information source, and not just a kind of hive mind, which is what it is right now. I'm really eager to see this. After our conversation, they will relaunch the big sites in a new way that Breitbart was working on at his depth, and I'm really eager to see what that is, because I'm sure that's going to be the next step in Internet news, and there's going to be a lot of people imitating.
In the wake of Breitbart's untimely demise and his fighting spirit, I'd like to go back to a question you explored at PJM a few months ago when you asked, quote, "Why don't conservatives make more attempts to seize the mainstream media back from the dishonest left?"
It's an amazing thing. I mean, part of it is that, it is a new American revolution. They are the British. They do have the empire. They have the empire of lies, as I always call it. They are amassed against us. Breitbart, there's not everybody who can take the kind of charges of racism and sliminess and evil that Breitbart fielded and stay on his feet. I mean, it's hard to do. You really, you wonder why so many prominent conservative spokesmen like Rush Limbaugh and Ann Coulter and Glenn Beck and Breitbart have a sort of brash style. Why don't we have more, Charles Krauthammers, more, kind of elegant, polite people who speak like them? The reason is in order to get prominence, in order to have your voice be heard against this noise of dishonesty that the mainstream media creates, you have to be willing, you have to have the personality to take those, massive hits again and again and again, personal, deeply personal hits, personal investigations. Any mistake you make is interpreted as being racist and hateful. So a lot of people just can't do that. They don't have that particular skill set. The more there are venues for us to speak, the more people will speak, the more it will become obvious, I think, to the rank-and-file American and the political American that there is no monopoly on decency on the left. It's rather the opposite. There is no their standards of decency are not decent. And the more we see that, I think the more people will be brave and start to come out and fight back. Right this minute, I'll be honest with you, Breitbart's death has me feeling a little down, has me feeling a little bit like we've suffered a terrible, terrible setback, not just personally, but politically. But overall, I'm very optimistic that we're going to go forward and seize back the narrative, because we're right and they're wrong.
Well, speaking of the ability to take personal hits, Andrew, you're one of the few openly conservative people working in Hollywood. Has that harmed your ability to work as a screenwriter over the years?
Personally, I estimate that it has cost me more than $1 million. Much more probably. But it's impossible to prove. So many things happen in the movie business. It's a really, really difficult business. So, when things aren't going well, you don't know what the causes are. I know that before I was a outspoken conservative, I was selling more than one script a year, just kind of turning them out and selling them. And afterwards, my phone stopped ringing literally for years. Although now I feel that it started again, and so there was this period of darkness. Whether that was all attributable to politics, probably not. There were other things going on at the time. strikes and the economy and such like. But there was a certain substantial amount of it that was due to politics. I have to tell you, and I say this without any, attempt to pose or to make myself sound any more courageous than I am, which is not much. I never lost a minute's sleep over it. The minute 9/11 happened, it really became an urgent fight. I think Obama's election made it an even more urgent fight because I think he's a very un-American president, and I think that to speak up is an obligation. It's a basic obligation of liberty and of freedom. And if it costs you some screenwriting gigs, when you consider what it costs people who fought in Iraq or who are still out there in Afghanistan, it's nonsense. It's nothing. So I never lost a moment's sleep over it. I have found plenty of work to do and plenty of useful things and things that I love, and I'm still back writing screenplays too. So it's not that tough a deal.
Let's talk a little bit about writing. You made an observation during one of the panels on the November National Review cruise where the topic was on the conservative novelist. And what I'm remembering is that you said that the novelist was sort of like being God in his ability to create and shape his own world. At least that's how I remember it. And if I'm right, could you amplify what you meant by that?
Well, yeah, I think that's conflating two different things that I said when I was comparing, when I was talking about the novelist, I was comparing that to screenwriting. I've always said that being a screenwriter is like being a carpenter because you kind of bang up this structure that other people are going to turn into a house. And other people have sort of are going to do the big planning and do the big, interior decorating. But when you're a novelist, you're like an architect. You plan this entire world, and everything that you do, everything that happens in it comes out of your imagination. So if a character has to walk across a room in a novel, you spend your entire morning creating the character, creating the room, creating the thoughts of the guy walking across the room, creating his footsteps. Every single thing in that scene and not in that scene is there because you put it there or don't put it there. When you're writing a screenplay, you write, he walks across the room. And so it's a very different form of working. My point about the conservative novelist and the conservative artist is that when people talk about a conservative artist or a liberal artist, they usually think politically. They think about guys who are writing usually thrillers that have patriotic heroes in them, or politically minded pieces that sort of show, it's the left is always showing how evil Republicans are, and every bad guy in a movie is a Republican and a conservative and all that stuff. That's not the way I think about it. I think about a conservative artist's role as creating a universe that is in which our moral universe is recognizable, so that it can be a fantasy world, it can be a science fiction world, it can be the real world, but it has to operate the way the world actually operates in moral terms. And once you do that, once you realize that there is a moral universe, we are living in it, and you write about it honestly, you're going to be a conservative novelist because certain corollaries, certain assumptions grow out of that knowledge that there's a moral universe, such as the irreplaceable sacredness of the individual, for instance, the necessity for the individual to stand against an overweening state, the obligation of the individual to do right by other individuals, and to stop for his freedom to stop where the other individual begins. All those things will come out of a properly depicted moral universe, which is why I think, for instance, Shakespeare is a wonderfully conservative artist, even though he shows you every possible color of the human spectrum. His plays take place within the moral universe as we know it, and therefore you can't get from them to the kind of statist slavery that the left wants to impose on us. You just can't get there from here. And that's the way I feel about conservative art. Is I don't have to sit down and write books in which everybody says, hooray, I love America, and all the heroes are, good conservative guys and all the bad guys are liberals. I don't have to do that, and I don't want to do that. All I have to do is show the world as it is morally, as the spiritual world of human beings is. And then I feel I will have fulfilled that role.
Let's explore the opposite of the moral universe for a moment. My last podcast interview was with Thomas Hibbs, the author of the book Shows About Nothing, about the growing strain of nihilism that has begun to pervade Hollywood in the last 20 years or so. Is that something you've noticed in Hollywood screenwriting, whether for TV or for the movies in recent years?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this idea that somehow multiculturalism is the kind of the face of relativism that we see most often in this idea that, all religions are a path to God, all cultures are equally good, there are no differences between us, only misunderstandings. That's something, if you remember that book, that wonderful book, The Closing of the American Mind,
Mm-hmm.
I think it was, I think the first line of that book was that every student who arrives in college knows that there is no such thing as right and wrong, and he was lamenting that because that's what's being taught to kids in our school. And I think that strain of nihilism is there very much. One of the other things that happened on the NRO cruise that was really interesting was we were talking about Shakespeare, and John Derbyshire mentioned Macbeth, the famous nihilistic speech of Macbeth, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, and life is but a walking shadow, and it's a tale told by an idiot, and so forth. And I was thinking about that speech afterwards, and I was thinking that Macbeth has violated every moral precept that there is. He's murdered, he has betrayed, he has, cheated, he has done every bad thing. And of course he's a nihilist, because he's destroyed the moral universe. If there were no moral universe, Macbeth would be a happy camper. He would be sitting there going, oh boy, I've killed my way to being king. But in fact, he has slaughtered the moral universe within, and so he's left with this despair. You can't tell a good story. The truth is you cannot tell a good nihilistic relativist story. And that's why the left's movies are so bad, and that's why people stay away from them in droves, unless they're French, in which case they go and sort of applaud politely, But that's not really what you're looking for. You're looking for art that speaks to people, and that's why art doesn't speak to people, because of that strain of relativism, which ultimately does become nihilism.
Your recent post at PJM on the 10 hardest movies to turn off once you start watching them
Yes.
had 3 films from the last 20 years, one of which was Roadhouse, and everything else was from prior decades. What does that say about the quality of Hollywood's product and whether or not it's, to use one of the environmentalist' favorite words, sustainable into the future?
I think that's a really good question, and I noticed that myself about my list. I just tried to make an honest list. I didn't try to make any points about it. Just movies that I hadn't. They weren't the best movies ever made. They were just movies that I happened to notice that if I bumped into them, I couldn't turn off the TV before they were over. And I think that you're absolutely right. The movies are fading as an influential art form. There's simply no question about it. If you watch, you don't even have to watch the show, but if you look at the Academy Awards and look at the movies that are nominated, none of them this year, with the exception of The Help, was a hit. They weren't hits. So that tells me, and yet the movies that were hits, like Planet of the Apes and X-Men, were really not Academy Award films, what we would think of as Academy Award films. And that tells us something. That tells us that Hollywood has lost the knack of making mainstream films that affect all of us that are also high quality. It hasn't lost the knack of making high quality films. It hasn't lost the knack of making popular films. It's lost the knack of making popular films that are high quality. And that's really important. That's a stage in the death of an art. That happened to literature after Joyce, when suddenly all the good novels were intellectual novels, and the popular novels were not quite as good, and that's something that happens as an art form is cycling down into irrelevance. I don't know, I have to be honest, I don't know whether leftists caused the death of movies, or if they're a symptom of the death of movies, because I've always maintained that leftism is just a form of decay, and so it may be that as an art form decays, it gets more and more leftist, just by coincidence. But it certainly is true that by putting forward this agenda, the feminism, the forced feminism in which every woman has to be able to wield a sword and throw a punch just like a man, which is just absurd, and it's not the life that we know, and it's ugly, and it makes women something that they're not, and it deprives them of the good things that they are. Nobody wants to really see that. Nobody really enjoys watching that because it's not their lives. So what you do is you wind up with an art form that's in the hands of people who are no longer speaking to the people because they despise the people. They despise everybody outside of L.A. and New York. So how can they address them? And as I say, I'm not sure whether leftism is a symptom or a cause there, but it certainly is contemporaneous with the decay of movies.
So, last question, where does that leave people who want to see enjoyable stories told in flickering light on a giant screen in a darkened room?
Get a big darkened room in your house and a tremendous television set. So that would be my advice. And the reason for that, by the way, is that, you know, it's not just so you can watch old movies, although that's one of the pleasures of it. But a lot of the great stuff that's being done now that does have the capacity to be popular is being done on television. And the reason for that, I think partly, I mean, this is a writer-centric way of looking at it, but in Hollywood they treat writers so badly that a lot of writers who once disdained to go into television now think, no, television is a nice place where they treat me well and where I'm in control of what I create. And so a lot of really good writers have gone over there, and you watch shows like Justified, which is a riveting crime drama. I mean, that I just sit there as somebody who's written crime novels most of my life. I sit there going, yes, that is how it's done. That is the way you create a great crime drama. You watch shows like Mad Men, The Sopranos, The Shield, The Wire, you know, just really, really good shows that do have a capacity to reach millions of people. Not only that, but the network shows, the shows that go out to even more tens of millions of people, you know, that really have a broad audience, have also lifted up in quality so that you have shows like ER and House and you know, The Simpsons is a good example. You know, lots of shows that are just tremendously popular that are of very, very high quality, far higher than anything that's come out in the theaters. And so, you know, art forms die. And are reborn maybe, but they do die. But art continues to exist, and I think it just moves from place to place, getting away from the leftists and intellectuals.
Okay. This is Ed Driscoll, and we've been talking with screenwriter, novelist, journalist, video maker, and all-around raconteur Andrew Klavan, a fellow columnist here at PJmedia.com. And Andrew, thank you very much for talking with us today.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks a lot.